Hello, can folks start to return to their seats, please? Okay, let me put this over here. All right, can folks start to return to their seats, please? Yeah, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. All right. All right. All right, so I'm going to begin. So welcome for those that were not able to join us this morning for the Anti-Racism Examine or are joining us now on live stream. My name is Leno Deggs III, and I serve as the Associate Director of Racial Justice Initiatives for the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service here at Georgetown. On behalf of the Center for Social Justice, the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, the DOA Engaging Difference Program, and the Office of the Provost, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2024 Teach the Speech Teach-In. Round of applause, please. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Orisanmi Burton to campus today. Dr. King's eulogy for the 4 little girls has been selected this year to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. This year's Teach the Speech Teach-In will explore the socio-political impact of an act of racial terror that took place on September 15th, 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The aftermath of this event not only reverberated through the city of Birmingham, but it also became a catalyzing event for the civil rights movement. I'm also here to provide an overview of our afternoon and orient everyone in the space, both physical and virtual, about our time together. Feel free to take care of yourself in the ways that you need throughout our time together. We are recording today's event. If you choose to ask questions during Q&A, your audio will be recorded. For more information about today's program and to access our resource guide around Dr. King's speech, please visit the Center for Social Justice website at csj.georgetown.edu/teachthespeech. Dr. Burton's book will also be available for purchase this afternoon during the book signing. I would like to now introduce Dr. Deo F. Gore to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Orisanmi Burton. Dr. Deo F. Gore is an associate professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Gore will facilitate the Q&A with Dr. Burton. Her research interest includes Black women's intellectual history, 20th century U.S. political and cultural activism, African American and African diasporic politics, and gender and sexuality studies. Dr. Gore is the author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, African American Women, Activists in the Cold War, which charts the political commitments and strategic leadership of a network of Black women radicals operating within the U.S. left from the 1930s to the 1960s. She is also the editor of Want to Start a Revolution, Radical Women in the Black Freedom Struggle. I'd like to welcome Dr. Deo Gore.
I need the bio you have. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on such a lovely day. It is such a privilege to be here and be able to introduce Dr. Burton and his amazing scholarship. I'm excited for his talk today and to link it to such an important scholar and activist, Dr. Martin Luther King, and this powerful eulogy he provided. It's just a real privilege. So I'm excited for the treat we're all in for. And let me start by introducing our speaker. Dr. Orisanmi Burton is an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. His research employs ethnographic and archival methods to examine historical collisions between Black radical organizations and state repression in the United States. Dr. Burton's work has been published in North American Dialogue, The Black Scholar, American Anthropologist, and Radical History Review, among other outlets, and has received support from the Werner Gern Foundation, at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the Margaret Casey Foundation. And I'll just add, he was selected in 2021 as a Freedom Scholar. I'm also mic'd, sorry. Doubly mic'd. A Freedom Scholar. Dr. Burton's first book, entitled Tip of the Spear, which I encourage you all, when you have the chance, which I think might happen at the end of this talk, to get a copy, to do it, read it, make study groups, learn it, and also ask him questions. This book, Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, was published by the University of California Press on October 31st, 2023, and makes us think differently, not only about our lives in this world, but the carceral state and freedom. It's my pleasure to call to the stage Dr. Burton.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Let me see. All right, I'm gonna set my timer so that I stay on time. So it was a real honor to receive this invitation. I had to ask, are you sure you wanted me to give this talk? Are you sure? Because I'm not going to offer maybe the kinds of remarks about King and about this event that folks might anticipate. But I was assured that this is what folks wanted, and I'm excited to be here. I racked my brain to come up with a title for the talk, and I landed on a not very exciting title, but a descriptive one, MLK, Birmingham, and the irresolvable question of violence. I am, of course, going to discuss eulogy for the martyred children, but I'm going to situate it in a much broader context. And part of what I want to do is to disrupt the ongoing sanitization and distortion of King into a non-threatening liberal apologist for multiracial U.S. empire, which is how he's often framed and memorialized quite literally. Just want to make sure this is working. All right. So for instance, I can see here. So for instance, if we think about the quotations included in the monument to King on the National Mall, we encounter these very idealistic and non-confrontational sentiments that can easily be appropriated and used for political purposes that are contrary to what King stood for. So for instance, King's words are sometimes evoked to support the actions of Israel. But while King always maintained that Israel had a right to exist, he was critical of Israel's settler colonial policies that aimed to erase the Palestinian people. Shortly after the conclusion of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, for example, in which Israel seized control of the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula, King said, quote, "I think that for the ultimate peace and security of the situation, it will probably be necessary for Israel to give up this conquered territory, because to hold on to it will only exacerbate the tensions and deepen the bitterness of the Arabs," end quote. So this presentation is really in dialogue with the recent work of Andrew J. Douglas and Jared Loggins, who deftly situate King's political philosophy within what political theorist Cedric Robinson called the Black radical tradition. A, quote, accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered through struggle. And this is a struggle against capitalist super exploitation, racial slavery, and imperialism. So King's criticism of Israel were increasingly linked to an understanding that imperialism abroad is linked to racial violence and oppression domestically. And in the last years of his life, he continued to understand and theorize and articulate that link. And I think that's really important for this historical moment for us to understand and remember. Through the framework of the Black radical tradition, Douglas and Loggins focus on King not as a uniquely eloquent and gifted individual, but as a figure who was embedded within and accountable to a political community that was engaged in a collective project to liberate themselves. They also focus on King's philosophy of nonviolence and how it resonates with what Cedric Robinson identifies as a general tendency within the Black radical tradition and the Black liberation movement to reject mass violence, revenge, and retaliation in response to racial and class oppression. And this is one of the questions that we'll be exploring today. And so these are the two key themes of the presentation, right? Thinking about King as embedded within a network of relations and thinking about, or really rethinking, King's philosophical and tactical relationship to violence and how others responded to that relationship. So I want to do this by putting King in dialogue with a different aspect of the Black radical tradition, and this is an aspect that I historicize and theorize in my book, and it's a criminalized tradition of Black radicalism, which is to say, it's what activist and organizer Stevie Wilson calls the imprisoned Black radical tradition, which is to say the revolutionary and abolitionist demands, aspirations, tactics, and strategies that emerge from populations that are held captive behind prison walls, the underclass, the sub-proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, people who are rendered surplus by capital, who are modestly educated, and who have been charged or convicted with criminalized acts, sometimes for explicitly political reasons, but most often not. And so King actually belongs to this tradition. His letter to the Birmingham jail is included in an anthology of imprisoned intellectuals, and it's, I think, one of his most powerful essays. So this is really what my book focuses on. It traces a protracted intellectual, political, and physical rebellion that occurred within and against prison walls, and it traces the various ways that prisons were compelled to mutate and reform in response to this political insurgency, arguing that what we call mass incarceration is really an institutionalized form of counter-revolutionary warfare masquerading as an apolitical crime control apparatus. But that's a talk for another day. And so I'm going to argue that the year 1963, and specifically the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which prompted King to deliver his eulogy for the martyred children, the speech selected for this event was a pivotal moment that accelerated the transformation of the Black liberation struggle from a movement that primarily focused on civil rights and was predominated by what King called a, quote, tactical theory of nonviolent direct action, end quote, to a movement in which Black nationalism and anti-colonialism came to predominate, along with a tactical commitment to armed self-defense and armed struggle. Black Power luminary Muhammad Ahmad, formerly known as Maxwell Stanford and was also a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, identifies the year 1963 as the end of the nonviolent direct action phase of the Black liberation struggle in America and the beginning of its transition to what he called the struggle's insurrection phase. And this transition was facilitated by two things: the persistence and intensification of white racial terror in response to successful civil rights agitation on the one hand, and on the other hand, to be quite frank, the inability of King and the organization to which he belonged, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to marshal a effective response to this terror, and to communicate how an extremist commitment to nonviolence would be able to contend with the forces of organized white supremacy who were committed to maintaining Black subjugation at all costs. So on the morning of September 15, 1963, 4 white supremacists detonated 19 sticks of dynamite on the back stairwell of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The explosion tore through the walls of the storage structure, killing 4 black girls who were there attending Sunday school. Their names were Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson. The explosion also injured 14 other people. This act of white supremacist terrorism was a calculated assault on the protracted Black liberation movement, particularly its rapidly developing civil rights phase. Because of its rigid pattern of racial segregation and its abysmal record of police violence and vigilante violence, Birmingham had come to be known as the Johannesburg of the South, a reference to the city that became the key focus of an anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, just as Alabama had become what King advisor Jack Odell called a major battleground for black people in the United States. The bomb exploded 1 month after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which came on the heels of several successful civil rights campaigns, the bus boycott, the sit-in movement, the Freedom Rides, and the Birmingham movement, which pressured local and state authorities to formally desegregate their municipal services and commercial districts. Dr. King traveled from his home in Atlanta to Birmingham the next day. Well known as a key spokesman for the movement, it's crucial that we remember that King was embedded within an organization where he honed his analysis and tactics, sometimes uneasily, alongside seasoned organizers like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Jack Odell, and many others. While many would cite the bombing as evidence that black people were demanding too much too soon, King argued that it reflected the failure of the movement to push harder, as he told the press, quote, "What murdered those 4 girls? The apathy and complacency of many Negroes who will sit down on their stools and do nothing and not engage in creative protest to get rid of this evil." So this is important. It really highlights the bravery that was necessary for nonviolent direct action. I was really moved by the excerpt of the prayer that was read earlier, written by Barbara Holmes, where she talks about this idea of being grateful for the crisis and for the disruption of order. And that's something that I think is very much in line with King's political philosophy. He talked about how nonviolence is not the absence of conflict, but the production of creative tension, and that the goal of nonviolence was to try to create a crisis in the prevailing political order. And so I just think that his bravery in the face of terrorism and his demand that, no, this is not a reason to slow down, but to push forward is really an example of that. King presided over a collective funeral for 3 of the slain girls, since, much to his dismay, the family of Carol Robertson chose to have a private service, choosing not to use the loss of their daughter's life and to project it as a casualty of the movement. So on September 18th, 1963, 8,000 people packed into the nearby 6th Avenue Baptist Church and overflowed into the Birmingham streets to pay their respects to the slain girls. His brief eulogy, that is, King, appropriately reflected the immensity of the loss experienced by the Birmingham community. He called the girls martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And he explained that they were speaking from beyond the grave. And he was demanding that we think capaciously about the cause of their death. Quote, "They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers," end quote. With these words, King enjoined the mourners to consider how what he would later term the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism were producing the ideology that had captured the minds of the bombers. And I want to urge us to think capaciously about King's critique of militarism and our understanding of militarism. So in 1967, King uttered another one of the quotes that are rarely memorialized. He said that the US government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And again, this is one of those statements that can't be incorporated into the national monuments because of the politics. He makes that statement as part of his condemnation of US imperialism and the US role in the Vietnam War, but as I argue in tip of the spear, the forces of organized white supremacy and permanent capitalist accumulation are consciously engaged in a domestic race and class war, and the church bombing is a prime example of that. So as historian Catherine Belew shows in her book, Bring the War Home, the people who carried out that bombing belonged to a formation of the Ku Klux Klan, and they were military veterans who had explosives expertise which they acquired in the military, and during their Klan rallies they often intermingled their military regalia with their Klan regalia and developed an ideology of domestic race war. And of course, this was not the first such act of terrorism in Birmingham. These were not isolated incidents. The bomb that killed the 4 girls was the 4th such bombing in less than a month. One desegregating neighborhood in Birmingham had been bombed so many times they called it Dynamite Hill. King also used the language of war. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? He says, quote, "The brunt of the Negroes' past battles were borne by a very small striking force who were actively engaged in a broad war against racism, poverty, and discrimination, a war for the transformation of a whole people." However, as is well known, King disagreed with the politics of collective black self-defense on both philosophical and tactical grounds. Even in the case of the bombing, what he called in the eulogy, quote, "one of the most vicious, heinous crimes ever perpetrated against humanity," end quote. His eulogy urged the people not to become bitter and to, quote, "resist the desire to retaliate with violence." Philosophically, King believed that violence was immoral and that employing it corrupted the souls of the people who engaged in it, whereas the suffering of enduring violence without resorting to retaliation would purify the soul. King affirmed this in his eulogy. Tactically, he believed that incorporating violence into a broader strategy of black liberation could not work because black people in the United States were numerically outnumbered and didn't have adequate firepower to survive combat. King's refusal to engage with the politics of self-defense and armed struggle were increasingly out of step with the politics of the movement after 1963. Which recognized that the question of whether or not there would be violence was never up to them, but up to their oppressors, who seemed intent on employing violence regardless of the response, because what they wanted was black subjugation at all costs. In his book, Parting the Waters, historian Taylor Branch recounts a contentious conversation between King and political strategist Diane Nash. Branch writes that after the bombing, Nash and another member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who had previously understood themselves to be nonviolent zealots, contemplated tracking down the bombers and killing them on their own. Instead, Nash presented King with an audacious plan to force Alabama Governor George Wallace out of office via a coordinated campaign of militant civil disobedience. Much to Nash's dismay, King brushed this plan aside and flew to Washington, D.C. the next day. She later revealed that she thought that King was, quote, "too eager to get to Washington for empty talks with politicians," end quote. And this is recounted by Taylor Branch. Indeed, in the days and weeks that followed, the SCLC failed to offer an organized response to the bombing. King's primary response was to petition President John F. Kennedy to send federal troops and marshals to Birmingham. And it was this lack of an organized and robust response to the Birmingham to the Birmingham bombing that I'm arguing accelerated this shift in the movement that I'm charting. And the shift is aptly summarized by James Baldwin, who 1 week after the bombing said, quote, "The only time that nonviolence has been admired is when Negroes practice it," end quote. In 1967, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, told an audience of students in Europe that Kingian nonviolence was premised on the idea that, quote, "If you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see you suffering and will be moved to change his heart." He only made one fallacious assumption, Ture continued. "In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none," end quote. Elsewhere, Ture estimated that by 1963, the year of the bombing, 90% of the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were carrying guns for self-defense because they were organizing in Mississippi, where they were constantly being terrorized by white vigilantes and racist police. So this wasn't publicly projected as part of SNCC policy, but it is what was happening according to Ture. So now I want to bring in a little bit from my own research, although this isn't in the book, but it is the prehistory of what I'm calling the Long Attica Revolt and this moment of prison rebellions that erupts in the early 1970s. The church bombing had a tremendous effect on blacks in prisons. This is a quote from a young gang leader named Anthony Costin. He and his childhood friend, Nathaniel Burns, were incarcerated in a rural upstate New York prison known as Comstock. 1963 was the year that the New York State prison system had become majority black for the first time in its history. Although it was located more than 1,000 miles north of Birmingham and well above the Mason-Dixie line, incarcerated people in Comstock, Attica, and elsewhere throughout New York State were subjected to a Jim Crow-style regime of racial subordination within the prison. Quote, "There was a dual set of rules for everything in Comstock. One black, one white," wrote Costin in his autobiography. "Whites had access to the best jobs, they got the best school assignments, they were more likely to make parole, food service, recreation, and other services were all racially segregated." According to Burns, it was not uncommon for black men to be beaten to death and for no one to hear about it. On September 27th, Costin and Burns participated in the Comstock prison riot of 1963, during which imprisoned black Muslims, nationalists, gang members, and petty criminals banded together to lash out against the brutal and racist prison regime. Quote, "It was raw. It was a real rebellion. Brothers were trying to hurt the white boys, anything white, prisoners, guards, police, anything." Burns told me this in an interview. Comstock authorities locked the front gates to prevent escapes, but the rioters managed to carry the activity from the prison yard into the cell blocks, at which point the riot engulfed virtually the whole prison. The rioting went on for multiple hours until prison authorities violently restored order with the force of roughly 150 guards armed with tear gas, billy clubs, axe handles, and attack dogs who were let loose on the prisoners. It is crucial that we understand that this rebellion was not simply a response to brutal prison conditions, but also to the church bombing and to the generalized condition of violent black subjugation. The point was hinted at by the commissioner of the New York prison system, who told the press that the captive population rebelled because they, quote, "wanted to show that they were behind the general movement of their race outside prison walls." So this is some of the coverage from the New York Times that you can see here. You probably can't see it, but take my word for it. At the bottom, there's a account of the Comstock riot of 1963, and then all surrounding it throughout the page are accounts of what's happening in Birmingham. The Comstock Rebellion of 1963 is significant for multiple reasons. First, it can be accurately historicized as the predecessor to the Harlem Rebellion of 1964, one of the first in a wave of hundreds of urban rebellions that ruptured American cities between 1964 and 1972. And this is something that King commented on frequently, right? He did not agree with rioting as a political tactic. At the same time, he never fully condemned riots, and in fact, acknowledged that they had an internal logic and that they were asserting demands through the act of rioting when he said, for instance, rioting is the language of the unheard. So this rebellion is also significant because of who Costin and Burns were, or rather who they became, in part because of the political consciousness they acquired through the process of rebellion, through the act of speaking the language of the unheard. Their political consciousness was transformed, and this was explained to me by Burns in an interview. Years later, Costin and Burns would adopt the names Lumumba Shakur and Sekou Odinga, respectively, and would go on to become key figures in the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party and its clandestine offshoot, the Black Liberation Army. While they recognized his rightful place, While they recognized his rightful place within the Black radical tradition, the Panthers' approach to violence was in direct contradiction with King's. Contrary to what the mass media will have us believe, they did not advocate violence, but rather collective self-defense against the normalized racial violence of U.S. empire. Whereas King believed that collective self-defense would trigger a racial holocaust, those are his words, the Panthers and the BLA believed that Black people's refusal to engage in collective self-defense facilitated such a holocaust. Both King and the BLA agreed that violence was already inherent in the situation. So the question really wasn't one of violence or nonviolence, because nonviolence is not the absence of violence. The question was between violence and counterviolence. The question was, should Black people redistribute the violence that up until that point was asymmetrically concentrated on them? So two things I want to say here kind of as an aside. The first is that Comstock Prison, otherwise known as Great Meadow Prison, is still very much a torture chamber that exists. As the New York Times reported 2 weeks ago, a new lawsuit charges that guards at the prison were systematically beating and waterboarding incarcerated Black people suspected of organizing to improve their situation. So I'm keeping track of this, and I'm waiting to see if the names of the guards will be released, but I would not be surprised if, similar to the Birmingham church bombing, the people who are alleged to have perpetrated this act had connections to white supremacist organizations and to the military. The other thing I want to say is rest in peace to Sekou Odinga, who passed away on January 12, 2024. And among his many daring acts was that he was part of a group who broke Black Panther and Black Liberation Army political prisoner Assata Shakur out of prison in 1979. And so what I hope I've done here is to sketch out how the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing tipped the scales and compelled a radical re-theorization and re-narration of the meaning of violence within the Black liberation movement. By 1968, King was forced to admit that, quote, the tactic of nonviolence, which had dominated the thinking of the civil rights movement, had, in the last 2 years, not been playing a transformative role, end quote. And so he was also in the process of rethinking his tactics, rethinking his philosophy. So I'm going to play the video, and I'm going to introduce it really briefly, right? So this re-narration of the role of violence in movements was on full display during an interview with activist and communist philosopher Angela Davis sometime in late 1970 or early 1971, about 2 years after King's assassination. At the time, Davis was in jail because firearms registered in her name were used in a daring attempt to break some other Black radicals out of prison. And so this interview was conducted while she was in prison for that.
Yeah, but the question is more, how do you get there? Do you get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman. I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a, quote, militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Burton, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
These are powerful words. She talks about how after the bombing, all of the men in the community organized themselves into armed formations and patrolled the community to ensure that no more violence occurred. So these comments demystify the ways in which black armed self-defense is in fact a violence reduction strategy. And here I also want to point out that if you read King's words closely, he never rejects the right of individual black people to defend themselves. He talks about this in multiple places and affirms that right. What he disagreed with was the use of collective self-defense as a movement strategy. And philosophically, he was opposed to it. But this is why I titled this talk, or at least subtitled it, the irresolvable question of violence, because the question, as it is so often posed to the primary targets of state violence and state-sanctioned violence, it's often asked to those people who have no control over whether or not the situation will be violent. So I want to begin to conclude where I began with the memorialization and representation of King, or rather with the misrepresentation of King, and with maybe a bit of irony, tragic irony for sure, but really more appropriately psychological warfare. And it's with a tweet that the FBI sent out on this past Dr. King holiday. And I hear some snickers, so people already get the irony. Quote, "This hashtag MLK Day, the FBI honors one of the most prominent leaders of the civil rights movement and reaffirms its commitment to Dr. King's legacy of fairness and equal justice for all." So just on its face, without really a deep reading, right, this discourse is reproducing the erasure of King's anti-imperialism. And it's focusing on these abstract ideas of fairness and equality, which can be easily appropriated, right, to the detriment of King's radical and militant anti-racism, his anti-capitalism, and these were aspects of King's ideology that were intensifying in the last years of his life. But of course, if we look a little bit deeper, we can unpack the profound disingenuousness of this statement. So these are excerpts, you might not be able to read them, from a March 4th, 1968 memo from the FBI's counterintelligence program that was written, again, on March 4th, 1968, exactly 1 month before King was assassinated. And the FBI includes him on its list of potential black messiahs who needed to be neutralized. And you can see here that they're very skeptical, that is the FBI, they're very skeptical of King's alleged obedience to nonviolence. They actually use that term and put it in quotes. And they list his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, as a black nationalist hate group. And so, so for those who don't know, the counterintelligence program was originally launched in the 1950s to destabilize the American Communist Party. In 1967, it was revised and transformed to target the New Left, and it was primarily aimed at neutralizing the Black Panther Party, but other black left and nationalist groups, including the women's and other groups like the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, the student movement, black bookstore, independent black bookstores. And they really did this via a counterinsurgency approach, that is to say, an approach that engages war domestically. And the phrase they use, neutralize, is really a euphemism for one of three things, or multiple of three things, which is convert, capture, or kill. And so this is what this document is attesting to. They're framing King as a potential black nationalist, and they have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference there listed as a hate group. So this is obviously absurd. But the thing that's interesting here is that it shows that when a movement attacks the foundations of empire, capitalism, racism, racial hierarchy, imperialism, that the state is going to interpret that movement as violent, irrespective of the actual methods it employs, right? And it's also important here to note, and this is key, that King, again, never totally condemned black people who engaged in counter-violence, because he understood that what they were responding to. He said, quote, "America is reaping the harvest of hate and shame planted through generations of educational denial and political disenfranchisement and economic exploitation of its black population. Now, almost a century removed from slavery," he's writing in 1968, I think, "we find the heritage of oppression and racism erupting in our cities with volcanic lava of bitterness and frustration pouring down our avenues." He wrote this in his essay, Showdown for Nonviolence. And in his speeches, King is constantly deploying the inevitability of violence from below as a way to create leverage for the SLC's approach and demands, right? In other words, if you listen to King closely, he's always invoking the inevitability of violence from below. And he's using that as a way to say, you should follow my path, because if you don't, this other thing is going to happen. And so 1963 is in many ways this pivot point in which the emergence of this other insurrectionist black tradition emerges. And the way that King is typically narrated is as diametrically opposed to that, but what I think is maybe a more productive way to think about it is the way in which King actually invoked this other tradition, at least rhetorically, as a way to advance his goals and as a way to advance his nonviolent philosophy. So this hard distinction between violence and nonviolence is actually really problematic. So I'll end with a few more words from one of my favorite King speeches, A Time to Break the Silence, where he says, quote, "We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak." He goes on to say, "These are revolutionary times all over the globe. Men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are beginning to be born." And I think these are critical words for us to contemplate in this historical moment, and I'll end it there and say thank you. Where should I go? Here?
Can we have one more round of applause for Dr. Burton? And so now we'll transition into the Q&A portion. We're going to have Professor Gore ask a few initial processing questions from this space, and then I invite you, as they are in conversation, to maybe note down questions that are coming up for you. So we will give space for a few folks to be able to share out and ask questions of Dr. Burton.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. You said you put so much in there, that powerful script, the real, I think, inclusion of King in so many different ways. I guess I want to start with a question that really struck me. I loved your framing of the Black radical tradition as a collective intelligence gathered through struggle. And it made me think, and I guess I'll ask you to approach it either way. Maybe what do we lose when we don't include both nonviolent strategies and violent strategies in that collective struggle? And what do we gain? What do we get to see or think differently about when we put King next to someone like Angela Davis or Ida B. Wells in conversation with King? Ida B. Wells, who maybe folks don't know, I work on was a very strong advocate of armed resistance when facing violence from during the period of lynching in the 1890s. So I'm curious, maybe can you talk a little bit about what would it mean if we actually celebrated King in his fullness alongside these other radicals?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks again, everyone, for being here. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that we situate King within a longer tradition. And so if you notice, I didn't talk a whole lot about the civil rights movement. I talked about the civil rights phase and a much longer, protracted movement. And that is very much a way of situating King's legacy within this longer movement. And I think, and this is also part of why I talked about, the representation of King, because I had an experience that maybe other people in the room have had, where in school, we learn about this very one-dimensional version of King and this idea of uncomplicated, unsophisticated nonviolence is just kind of drilled into us. And so part of what I hope I was able to do in the talk is help us to think about how King was really thinking tactically and strategically. He had his own morals, his own philosophy, but was also thinking more capaciously about the political environment and thinking about where he could kind of intervene in this environment. And I think what is lost when we don't think about King in that way is the complexity and the dynamism of these movements. and a kind of fetishization of extremist nonviolence, which never really worked in a vacuum. To the extent that nonviolent tactics worked, they worked because they were part of this broader context. In which, because in order to engage in politics, you have to have some kind of leverage. And so the way the story is often narrated, or at least the way it was narrated to me when I was a kid, and part of why the FBI likes to celebrate King in this particular way is because there's a narrative that's presented that, you know, King just genuinely did appeal to the conscience of racists and they had like an awakening. And I'm sure that happened for many people, but that was not the dominant, I don't think that that was the sort of dominant dynamic. And I think many of the people around King understood that as well.
That's interesting. I mean, I think such an important point to make, and that picture of him, the quote from the FBI reminds me of the CIA's statue of Harriet Tubman, and I just thought, what world do we live in that we don't know so little about these figures that we can see them in this moment. And I'm also curious if you can talk, and I guess we should also tell people they have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'll do one more question and maybe open it up, folks, so you know you can write your question down. I'm not going to hog the mic the whole time and just have a private conversation with them, although I could. But now I have to choose my last question carefully. All right, I think I have it. I really enjoy the ways in which in your presentation and in your book, I think you challenge our sense of the carceral state in prisons as sort of inside a place and we as outside, and I thought you're invoking of the riots that happened in 1963 and then the Harlem riots. It's connecting them is one example of that, where we see the ways there is, however you think about the carceral state in prisons, to imagine what happens inside is totally separate from what's happening outside, I think is one of the things, the work your book does to dismantle that and see a sort of conversation in a structural, systematic ways in which these are working. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't know if other people were, but I was struck by that connection you made, this riot here to the Harlem riots. And obviously people talk to the Watts riots in '64. We can think about the string of them. And then King did make that powerful statement in the midst of them that this is the language of, or sort of the oppressed and of resistance in some ways, when you give them no other mode to sort of survive or express themselves.
Right, right, yeah, thank you. So King, so a couple of things. You know, so my book is an elaboration of Black radical theory that emerges in the 1970s. One of the key arguments of that theory is a specific way, as Deo just alluded to, of looking at the prison, which is to say that the prison is not a hermetically sealed institution where people who are convicted of criminalized acts are sent, but rather that it's a microcosm for the broader world, and that it's a concentrated form, that if you look at the prison, or if you are trapped in a prison, you are subjected to a concentrated form of the policies, practices, and tactics of control and domination that all of us are subjected to on the so-called free world. So they would say things like, oh, I'm in prison, I'm just in maximum security prison, you're on the outside of the walls, you're in minimum security prison. And there were all of this different kind of carceral language that they employed to help people see that even those of us who are outside the walls are not fully free, and in fact maybe are more unfree than those who are inside because they think they're free. And you know, King also used carceral metaphors. He talked about how, you know, racists or people, so racists were trapped in a kind of ideological prison that they weren't able to see. And then he also talked about how what he called ghetto dwellers are trapped in the prison of the ghetto, right? So King was part of this as well. So this whole thing about, you know, yeah, when I learned about the Comstock prison rebellion of 1963, you know, which precedes the Harlem rebellion of 1964, which is really a significant rebellion because it's often historically narrated as one of the first in this string of rebellions. But there's this prison rebellion that happens in '63, and the people who are in the prison are members of the Black Panther Party, members of people who would later go on to be in Attica. people who would later actually participate in the Harlem Rebellion. And they didn't understand the Comstock as separate from these other things. And that's why I included the quote from the prison commissioner who said, look, they engaged in this prison rebellion in here to show their solidarity with movements outside the walls. And so one of the ways that prisons function as a technology of counter-revolutionary warfare, which is what I argue in my book, is by mystifying that relationship and by trying to induce us into not seeing the significance of prisons and how prisons are really not really about reforming or targeting the people who are inside them, that really on a political level, prisons are about targeting us in a particular kind of way, about shaping our ideology, about inducing us to engage or not engage in certain kinds of behaviors. So yeah.
Which I think is so important, because when you think about activist stories from this period and even other moments, Black activist stories, many of them talk about the first experience with the police or being imprisoned for their activism as these really profound moments. I can think about some of the civil rights activists there talk about, when I went to jail for the first time, this taboo that I was never supposed to do, it forced me to think about the world differently, because I met the people there, and they were like me, you know, they were like for but a few differences, and so I think that's such a powerful example, and I just think your book does such important work in that, and does this job I love. If you haven't read the book, I encourage you to. He starts with a Queen Mother Moore quote, and speech she gives, and it's so powerful, but it does speak to this collective tradition of the Black radical. She's speaking in 1973, but had been an activist since the 30s.
Yep.
So I just think it's beautiful work, much welcome work in the movement.
You.
I'm going to ask, I don't know if you have a process for the Q&A, if people have questions. Rory.
So checking on time, we have about space for 3 or 4 folks who have questions they want to share out, depending on length of your responses.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I want to invite folks to raise your hand, and then we'll have one of these folks who are standing up bring the mic over to you.
All right, and maybe I'll ask one more. We'll give you time to marinate and think. I realize it was a lot. I think another question I had, maybe I'll just say these things that struck me, and hopefully I won't have to ask all my questions. I noted King's use of the word martyr and talking about the women, the 4 girls who were killed, and just what that meant in terms of movements and things like that. And I also noted the powerful clip you showed of Angela Davis, and how much that I thought so powerfully speaking to having grown up in Birmingham and experienced that violence and what that meant. And I guess I will use those points to ask a broader question about this relationship between state violence and I guess what you framed as state-sanctioned violence. And maybe can you say what those two things are a little bit? Like, what's the difference between state violence and state-sanctioned violence? I have an idea. And I just thought how that might relate to the quote Angela Davis said, and I think how we think about it even present day, how these things happen when the state authorizes sort of violence either in practice or rhetoric against certain communities, and then what happens on the ground. And she talks about it in terms of Bill Connor getting on, oh, these people have done this, something bad might happen. And it just struck me that we often draw a sharp line between those, but they are often, much of the violence that happens in the everyday where we're like, that's a bad apple, that's a bad person, is sanctioned through state practices as well. And I wonder, can you talk about that and the specifics of those?
Sure. I mean, I use that Angela Davis clip in my classes because it's, it's so powerful, it's so evocative. Yeah. One of the things that's interesting to me is that she's making an argument about the temporality of violence, about when things get understood to be violence, and that question itself is a form of violence. And that's why she rejected the question, because the interviewer made it somehow seem like it was the question of violence was somehow her responsibility. And she said, by asking me that question, what you're doing is you're normalizing and naturalizing this intense condition of violence that I grew up in, that was all around me. But you refuse to see that. You only want to ask about violence when someone is responding to violence. And so again, the question is not about violence or nonviolence in a like an ontological sense, because there's always violence in the situation. And even nonviolence as a tactic is the use of violence. Because King was hoping that people would see the violence that was being waged upon people who refused to retaliate and have some kind of awakening. So he's employing violence through its negation, at least rhetorically. And so that's the thing that I think is so brilliant about Angela Davis's sort of redirection of that question. The difference between state violence and state-sanctioned violence, I mean, yeah, I think it's a blurry distinction. I think it doesn't always hold up. I think it breaks down. I mean, you know, so the bombing was not officially carried out by agents of the state, although these were military veterans, right? So it wasn't technically state violence, but like I mentioned in the paper, it was the most recent in a string of attacks. And the federal and state and local government did not do nearly enough to prevent that kind of violence from happening. So in that way, it was sanctioned by the state. And so I guess that's how I would maybe provisionally answer that question in this moment.
See a few hands.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I'm really interested in how your findings can go beyond the walls of this university in general. And I ask this as a person who has 2 kids in private and public school who understand and learn a very sanitized version of MLK. And like very recently, I had a conversation with one who, you know, came home and was like, oh, the Black Panther Party's really bad. And that's essentially what they sort of learn in school. And so I wonder what you think about how we take this narrative and these stories to a broader audience, and sort of what can be our beginning or starting point with some of that, especially in the context of changes that might be happening in the public school curriculum in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you so much. The question of curriculum, I mean, obviously that's a huge fight that's only going to get bigger. I mean, I think at minimum is like we could just read King, like read him, read what he said. You know what I mean? I just don't think that that happens enough. I think that so many, I mean, he's such a beautiful orator. He said so many beautiful things that you want to remember. And I think that the things that we are encouraged to remember are very specifically curated to reproduce precisely that kind of dichotomy. And I think that if you just sit down on King Day, just once a year, instead of, you know, just re-articulating the same tweets, just read one of his speeches and sit with it and really think with it. So I think he was a really profound thinker, but I think that that's gonna, but I think, you know, the curriculum question is a big one that I'm gonna dodge, but I think that reading groups, I mean, I think part of the problem is that the expectation is that that public schools will do the work that communities should be doing on their own, and so forming independent study groups and reading and talking about King and complicating the sound bites whenever possible is a start. But I have kids too, and I deal with the same thing, and I totally understand and feel your question.
All right, we're going to take maybe a couple more questions. Are we already, who has the microphone here? You want to say your name and then?
Sure, Arjun Shankar. Thank you so much. It was amazing. And all I could think about was, while you were speaking, is the ruling this morning. And I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at it, so I'll just outline it for you real quick. I mean, the ICJ, I mean, it's been celebrated. It's a convoluted ruling, but they've said that Israel needs to watch out for genocidal behavior, so that's celebrated. But on the other hand, they did not rule for immediate ceasefire, right? And what that says, I think, going to your work, is they were not willing to rule against state violence immediately, right? So I'm wondering if you could just talk about how you might think about why they want to do that, what it says about state violence, state-sanctioned violence, and you started with Israel, so you can dodge this if you want to, but if not, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm not up to date on that. I was working on this morning, so I didn't see any news. I mean, I can answer that question by thinking about King's relationship to Israel, which was a complicated relationship, which I tried to sort of allude to in the talk. He did visit Palestine and Israel and had a transformative experience there, talked to people who were subjected to apartheid, and really transformed his thinking. At the same time, he was always very careful and mindful that he did not want to alienate many of the people that had been supporting him and his movements. He was heavily courted by Israel, invited multiple times by Israel to come and to observe the situation from their perspective, and at each of those occasions he declined to do that. And the quote that I read was actually a response to a question during a radio interview where he actually had made more of a kind of general statement and then was pushed by the radio interviewer and said that in response to a question. So there was some unease there. And so I think that those tensions are representative of the sort of broader geopolitical tensions that, you know, the UN and the ICJ find themselves in having to rule on what I think is a really straightforward question of whether something is or isn't genocide. It is. If you read Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide, it's clear. There's no question about it. So that's how I'll answer the question.
And then we have one more question. Someone already. It's time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Annalisa Buttici, Department of Theology and Religious Studies. I am so happy to meet you today because I've been reading your work since the first article you published.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, I'm very impressed by the work that you are doing on prison. I'm also part of the Prison and Justice Initiative, adjunct faculty, so I've been teaching in prison at the DC jail since January 2020. And so I thought in the time of the Black Lives Matter, and now with war in Gaza. And especially now, I've been very, very touched by my incarcerated student solidarity with the people of Gaza. And I'm wondering if you can say something about solidarity in prison beyond the civil rights movement, if you came across any other example of solidarity in the history that you have been studying in prison.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, one of the things that my book is writing against is this historical tendency to domesticate prison movements, to make it seem as though they're only focused on improving prison conditions, when in fact, you know, the core of the aspirations of many of these movements are about transforming the world that make prisons necessary, that in fact require prisons, and undoing that, and to sort of try to chart out the transnational dimension of prison struggles. And so I focus on re-narrating the Attica Prison Rebellion of 1971, which is a story that many people think they know, but I think that they should rethink what they think. And one of the things that I found was that through couriers and correspondence mediated by lawyers and others, that people in Attica in the process of that rebellion were in direct correspondence with third world liberation movements. They were in correspondence with third world liberation movements in Vietnam, in Latin America, and in Portuguese, the parts of Africa that were colonized by Portugal, Guinea-Bissau, and other places. And you know, in one of the letters, they talked about how the Palestinians and the Mozambicans were their inspiration, and in many ways, the correspondence was, you know, back and forth. And so this is a kind of abolitionist internationalism, as I call it, which is, I think, the only kind of abolition that would ever be worth anything. So I think, yeah, and you know, and King talks about in his letter to the Birmingham jail, he talks about how there was something about his incarceration that was productive, which is that it gave him the time and capacity to think in a really deep way. And so I think that, like, folks need to realize that a lot of people behind the walls are doing a lot of deep thinking, a lot of deep studying, a lot of communicating, and they're engaging politically, even though geographically they might be incapacitated. Politically, many of them are very active and at the cutting edge of a lot of philosophy, critical theory, and other things. So, yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. So, should I just thank you all for the question? I think we're going to end it here. I guess I want to just encourage everyone. Dr. Burton has given us a profound reading list, some viewing, you know, take note, and I believe there's going to be opportunity to get his book. I think you should definitely add that to the reading list because it clearly has a lot more to tell us about how we move forward in this world.
Okay. Yeah, so just like I want to say thank you to Dr. Burton and thank you to Dr. Gore. Yeah. So again, genuine gratitude for you being with us today. We are so grateful for your knowledge and wisdom, for your presence, and for your time here with us today. Excuse me. As we depart, we encourage you to reflect on what you've learned today. What next steps will you take? What connections have you made today? What ideas do you want to explore more? We also invite you to stop by the book table outside and purchase a book and get it signed by Dr. Burton. And lastly, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank those who worked so hard to make today happen. Chaplain Tony, my CSJ colleagues, Andrea, Fatima, Lucia, Haley, Nicole, Lamaria, and Ray. Also, many thanks to Blue Street Productions for AV support and for live streaming us today. Finally, no event at Georgetown can happen without the facilities and hospitality crews that work to make our spaces inviting and keep us nourished throughout today. Thank you again for joining us. All right. So I think we want to give Dr. Burton a little bit of a break, and then we'll transition to the book signing space. Yeah. All right. And there's coffee and tea. So yeah, this will be the formal closing of the program. No. Well, I don't think there's anyone who needs interpretation for the book signing, but y'all can stay around for maybe the next 10 minutes. Yeah.